this is a purely methodological talk. I've had a couple of discussions about methods. So, and I think we've had sort of some of the consensus was we really don't know in networks so much about sort of how to collect data. Once we collect data, what kind of data, what to do with it, how to make hypotheses, how to test hypotheses. A lot of the stuff is still very, very, very new and fresh, and particularly in dynamic networks. We're only now starting to kind of have a sense of how to sample maybe static networks that don't change. But how do we sample dynamics? What do we mean by dynamics? We spent the whole previous session talking about what do we mean by dynamics. So I'm going to talk about the methodology part of it, hitting on some of these points, hopefully. So, because here's what used to be, that's David, looking at his gelato, so writing down observations. So you either have a focal individual, scan the population. This is very sparse data. Certainly you don't get the very, very high resolution dynamics. And recently we have a lot of high resolution data on social networks at a very different temporal scale, right? And there's lots of it. And there's, and I'm sure some of your data is here. We can put we can put video with QR codes, which is from Lausanne. We can put GPS collars. We can put GPS collars on baboons. Sorry, there's Meg, and it's the same one as Damien. And so we now have this 20 million points per baboon in this data. So that's every second resolution. We can put GPS, we can put camera traps and or get tourists or students in this case with cameras, and we can infer that we can identify individual animals from these photographs and say, so now we can infer the network purely from the photographs. In fact, not only zebras, but pretty much anything that's practically spotted by this point. So we can now collect enough data on this network. So now we really have too much data, and a lot of it is junky, noisy, and not really, the signal starts getting lost. So you can get drones and also, okay, so really we're now both ready and not ready for for very different statistical, computational, and even data collection protocols, right? It's statistical and computational approaches to analyze all these data. And so some of the methodology translates directly to all these other networks, gene regulatory, human social, communication, email, cell phones. This is Facebook. So to the discussion of social versus spatial, the continents emerge. They're not drawn here at all. Each node is put directly at the hometown location, and then the friendship links are drawn. And then what you see is the emerging of the outlines of the continents directly from that. So there is clearly spatial components to that social network, right? So and so what are the current sort of state-of-the-art computational methods for analysis of dynamic social networks, and why dynamic matters? Well, why dynamic matters, and so there are three aspects of the dynamics that really matter if you care. If we have a network, let's say like this, a simple sort of everybody's walking in a line, and you have the same weight, let's say 1/5 frequency on each one. So if this is your aggregate view, sort of how we used to represent these networks, there are many, many dynamic scenarios that could have given rise to this specific network, right? You could have had just one edge, one interaction happening in one time step. There are 5 of them, so you have 1/5 weight on each one. That's the aggregate view of those 5 time steps. You could have had the same interactions but happen in a different order, right? So the order interactions, if the order of interactions matters, then the dynamics matter. They all could have just spoke to each other, once at the beginning and then never seen each other again, and still the aggregate view is still the same aggregate view. So the concurrency of interactions matter. So there are 3 things: the duration, the order, concurrency, and duration of interactions that actually define a dynamic network. And if those 3 properties matter to you, then you care about dynamics. right? And so that also, but on the other hand, to flip it, that also allows us to test for a lot of dynamic properties and separate noise from signal in the dynamic network. It's the when the order, concurrency, and the duration of interactions matter. That's what that's the signal, the dynamic signal versus noise. Okay, what's out there? Not that much. For dynamic networks at this sort of nice stable level of here's some software, don't use it sort of stuff, because dynamic network analysis is a field computationally, statistically, and mathematically that's existed for the last maybe, even if we go to the earliest 15 years, right? So it's sparkling fresh new. We only defined some of the terminology less than 5 years ago, as in what's a dynamic clustering coefficient, right? So that's the sad news for people who want to use it. The very exciting news for me, because I can publish papers, right? So probably I'll start sort of. This is if you've heard about Sonia. Sonia stands for Social Network Image Animator. It's not an analysis tool, it's a visualization tool. So people sometimes say, what about Sonia? Sonia is not an analysis method. So there's Sienna, which is Tom Snyder's baby, and a suite of methods mainly based on ERGMs, exponential random graph models, and the approach is to essentially, in a very, very sort of high level, 3,000 feet, whatever, 300,000 feet view, is that you can look at different properties, and I think, Katie, you alluded to this a little bit earlier. You can look at different properties in networks such as triadic closure, you know, the number of triangles versus open versus dyads with a missing edge, and all these kinds of structural properties and their distributions with respect to what you would expect at random, right? So you can build different random baselines. So that's one way to see RGMs, and you can fit RGMs, and then you can test whether the properties that you have in your network, how significantly different they are from a sort of baseline. But I think, Amial, you're going to talk more about Sienna tomorrow, right? Okay. So there's also a temporal, sort of longitudinal version of ERGMs now. The thing is, when you start fitting lots of, so to fit statistically a model that has many features, right, many structural characteristics, and to distinguish it from the probabilities of a random network with this many characteristics in a temporal sense, so that becomes computationally infeasible. So longitudinal version of RGM right now cuts, gets around this problem in a somewhat hacky way still, so it's not quite mature enough to prime time. So use with caution. And then there's a nice paper, Tina, by Tina, well, by others and Tina, and James, and Big James. So two of the authors are here, right? Right? Yeah. Which summarizes sort of the existing methodology out there for dynamic network analysis, for temporal dynamics, and explicitly describes two R packages. Am I right that Ben Blonder was the name? Yeah. Okay. So two R packages that allow to kind of look at the dynamics of the network, but in a sense that if you look at a dynamic network, just like I showed before, as a series of snapshots, you can look at the time series of measures of the normal metric measures on these snapshots, right? And so it starts getting at some of the dynamics, but in some way it doesn't take the dynamics of the whole network into consideration. So there are questions on dynamics of networks that would explain explicitly sort of rely on the dynamics of the whole network that that has been started to be asked more in the social networks of humans, rather. And so I'll describe a little bit here. So one of the first questions that, if you observe the network for a while, and one of the first questions that typically asked about any time series, right, any process, the temporal process, is the question of both autocorrelation and prediction. Right? So how do you do autocorrelation in networks? How do you do prediction in networks? Those are two slightly different things. And so why bother? So that's I spent just now the whole sort of big philosophical discussion of predictive versus descriptive versus explanatory models. Nothing I talk about is explanatory. No computational method is explanatory. Explanation comes from you. What we can provide is descriptive and predictive, right? And in fact, computer science is very biased in this way. We really are interested much more in predictive modeling than descriptive modeling. Because to us, if you can predict well, that means we to the first approximation, we understand the process, understand statistically, right? Not in any descriptive, not an explanatory way. So we can act on it because we kind of know, if we can predict well, we know what's going to happen. We can prepare for it because that's what matters for marketing and social networks. But we can potentially play the what-if scenario if the predicting model is statistically capturing in sufficient detail the underlying processes. The more interesting part is what happens when predictions fail. If you have been predicting for a while very well, and then suddenly your predictions fail, then something interesting probably has happened, or your model is not good enough. Okay, so there are a couple of flavors of this in computer science, all kind of known as network prediction and link prediction. So I'll start with what else out there. So the general domain and what other things are there. There's this whole line of research on generative models coming mainly from physicists. So started mathematicians in this case. Berger-wolf graphs, right? So you model the actual formation of a network. For example, random graphs, right? So Berger-wolf graphs, where probability of an edge is the same for everybody, and eventually one of the first results, what's considered a network analysis, is that then you will have a giant connected component if the probability is high enough. And we know exactly what probability. So then there's whole models based on degree distributions. Physicists have noticed that it looks like maybe these degrees, the number of nodes with a particular degree, if you fit it, looks maybe as a power law, which it is not. We now know that it is not. But so what kinds of processes then would give you networks that look like this, right? So you can model. So now the leading sort of leading model, generative model, is called BETR, B-T-E-R, that can model, clustering coefficient, task distribution, degree distributions, and doesn't have to be power law. So it can fit whatever your network actually is, or whatever you want to see in your network. It will model it quite nicely. So that's one way to look at the dynamics of the network. What kinds of processes would create networks like this? Right? That's predicting a network. Another way of sort of related question is link prediction. So if I've been observing my network for a while, and I've seen certain relationships happen, but I haven't seen yet interaction or friendship or grooming between those two baboons. There seems to be a lot of baboons. How likely is it that this relationship will be there, occur at some point in the future, right? So that's link prediction. What I'll show a little bit about is, and here's a comment, and I will run out of my half an hour, I know for a fact. Here's a comment where the spatial and the social kind of interact. In in human social networks, we've had algorithms for link prediction for a while, and this is in the context of things like Facebook and LinkedIn and cell phone calls. So, and very simple heuristic works. You predict a link between two individuals that have not been interacting yet, that have not interacted yet. You predict a link with probability proportional to the intersection of their neighborhood. The more neighbors they have in common, the more likely they are. And this is kind of a form of triadic closure. Duh, almost. Except 2 years ago there was a proof by Deepa and Chakrabarty and some others from Google that this is true if and only if the network is embedded in a metric space. Yeah. So the only time you will have that property, that the probability of a link is proportional to the neighborhood, so Lada-Damish's algorithm, is that if the network is embedded in a metric space. So by going back, inferring a network from proximity, what are we doing? Well, we're essentially, defining the network from the metric space. And then, yes, of course, so now we have a network where the probabilities, by definition, the probability of any link is proportional to the neighborhood, and so it's just a translation from one space to another. We really don't need the network then. Whatever we infer on the network, we can infer on the original space, and that's the only thing we're doing, which is why it's good to have dynamics, because once you introduce dynamics, that doesn't work anymore. So then you can ask the additional power of the social, what does it give you for the spatial, if you have dynamics, but only then. Okay, back to network prediction. So if you can ask the network prediction question in exact structural things. So ERGMs ask this kind of the longitudinal of ERGMs. Think of any observation of a network as an instance from the distribution of networks like it, somehow, right? So longitudinally, the version of ERGMs would ask this kind of dynamic network, right? If I'm going to predict, then there's a whole distribution of futures that is possible. Right? That is also a way to ask the network prediction question, and we right now don't quite know how to do it. But what we can do is much simpler version is I'm looking at a network not as an instance from a distribution, but this particular network. So how can I predict what exact structure, to what extent can I predict the exact structure of this network 5 time steps from now? Okay? Well, it's a much simpler question actually. Okay. And so, there's also very, very complex realistic models, and that's what most of the science is, right? You actually build very explicit models of your network dynamics, and then you can fit it and test it, and test the fit, and test it against other hypotheses. That's if you know what's going on in your network. And yes, fantastic. There's also typically these models are highly specialized. So this is a more general approach. So if you've observed the network for a little while, this is a toy example. You want to know what it's going to look in time step 4, and time step 5, and time step, purely from past history. So the approach is very simple, and it's in fact there are a couple of ways to think about it. One way is to kind of that this is you're inferring a hidden Markov model of the following variable. This matrix is every edge by every edge, and what you record is the number of time steps from the occurrence of one edge, let's say AB, to the occurrence of BC, right? So it occurred, AB occurred, and then 1 time step later BC occurred, and 2 time steps later BC has occurred, and then because AB has occurred again, you restart the count. So what the hidden Markov model here is, the variable here is the delay between the occurrence of edges, right? So remember I said what defines dynamic of networks? Is the order, concurrency, and delay, right? Or duration, those are actually translatable. So this is modeling delay explicitly as a hidden Markov model, as a variable, hidden Markov variable, the emitted variable, of the network that defines the dynamics of the network. Okay? So if that's indeed the case, so what you get after a while in empirical probability distribution between the currents of any two edges, and what we know then from, if you observe it long enough, the mode of this distribution is the most likely, it's maximum likelihood predictor, and you also have the estimate, which is the variable of the mode, right? So you also have the probability of that occurrence, which is the conditional probability. You can compute all the details in preview, but the sort of, you actually now obtain the expected delay for any pair of edges. Yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, there's the frequency of edges. Every time I see a delay of 1, I add that. So this is the frequency. This is how many times the delay 3 has occurred between those two edges. Okay? So this particular word encodes both the order and the delay, with the frequency in it. Yes. So it's okay. So now I can actually I have the estimate of the likely delay. I can build a network, except there are a couple of caveats. If this treats the edges as independent, you can deal with it by looking at frequent subgraphs rather than edges. I can talk offline about that. You can build and what they are, and you can build the whole machinery. And here's what it gives for baboons. This is all the frequent subgraphs and frequent subgraph in this case is anything that occurs at least twice, right? So it's so all the frequent subgraphs by frequent subgraph. Oh no, sorry, this particular one only the top 40 frequent subgraph or something like this. So there's a cutoff, and so every one we only kept the mode of the probability of the mode, right? The conditional probability of the mode. So you see there's some things that have some relationship that if this occurs, then that occurs, that are super predictable. The other thing to note here is that predictors are not the same as the predictable, right? So it's not a symmetric matrix, right? The high predictors are not the same as predictors. So you can also extract the actual structure. Some things are very expected in terms of if this occurs, then in this case 1 time step later that occurs. Those two independently, not connected to each other. There's a lot of relationships as an addition of one node to an existing edge, triadic closures. But then there are some weird ones that if 13 and 9 interacted, then 1 time step later 18 and 6 will interact. With probability 0.99199. Right? So we're still trying to figure out for baboons what it means, and most of this relationship is telling that most of them are 1 time step with a delay of 1. For a cell phone network of 30 million people, we have some more interesting things, which again, which are measurable in hours, and you can act on it, and you can extract all kinds of structural information out of it, or email of environs, but we're not talking about humans. So one thing that this means is the reason that for baboons it may or may not be interesting. Again, it's a tool. You can define the network however you want. You can run it and figure it out. But probably what we have there is the network is not defined right yet, and the time scale we're looking at it is not right yet. So the time scale here we aggregated at 140 seconds. Why? Because there was a little bit of an analysis. How do you find this right time scale? Because what happens is if you look at your network at too fine time scale resolution, we had this discussion already, then the network is either very sparse. So if you're thinking of something like ant networks, right? There's only 1 or 2 interactions that happen every second. The rest of the network, nobody's interacting with anybody. If you look at baboons, then the network doesn't change too much. It may be not sparse, but it doesn't change much from one second to another, right? However, if you aggregate it too much, then you will lose the order and concurrency information of the interactions. So you've lost the important dynamics. Remember, the order, concurrency, duration. So somewhere in between, there is that sweet just right, Goldilocks zone, and we know that it exists. There is a beautiful paper, so it's called On Non-Stationarity of Human Contact Networks, whereas what it actually they proceed to show in the next 4 pages that there is stationarity at different scales, right? So there's actually different scales of stationarity. They took the network and they transformed it in like various non-trivial ways, and then they ran wavelet analysis. Wavelet analysis is a standard tool that does this frequency decomposition for all kinds of signals, from voice and your cell phones to the universe, right? They use it in astronomy to find to separate the different signals of different stars. So this is the days of the week. No, sorry, this is the hours. This is for all individuals. So there's the clearly one scale at which things happen is around 8-ish hours, 8, 9, 10, something like that. It's probably 12. Then there is another one right around here, which is 24, not surprisingly. Then there is another one which is weekly. That's the one that encompasses this. So somewhere, sorry, I'm doing the math right. But there is the clear sort of day-night, day, 24-hour, week, and so on and so forth. And so there are clear different time scales at which network processes happen, and the signal comes through. And in fact, you can prove that if there is a process that you observe through network interaction, and if the process itself is stationary, not static, stationary, means the dynamics of it doesn't change, but the process can be quite dynamic itself. Then by looking at linear transformations of the adjacency matrix of it's a long way to say, you can prove that you can recover an oversampled network. So if you oversample the network at below the actual scale of the process, right? If you undersample, nothing can help you ever. Yes, but if you oversample, then aggregating the network at the scale at which the process is stationary, and only then will give you a stationary time series of measures on the network. And if you aggregate it at any time scale above or below, you will have a non-stationary process. So the problem, so we know that we can recover. The problem is that this is an existence, not a constructive proof, which means we don't have an algorithm, but we have a heuristic that will kind of follow through on this typical trade-off. What's hidden there is the trade-off between the noise versus information, right? Noise to information signal, and I'll quickly blink what you get out of it. So if you run that algorithm, it's available. We have the code. It's a heuristic, not an algorithm. So and you get that time scale at which you're supposed to aggregate. So this is the Enron email network. We haven't run it on baboons yet, just because we haven't defined the network. We haven't really defined the network yet. What do we mean by an edge? So we keep on going back and forth there. So if you do it if you aggregate it too little on too small time scale, then it's too noisy. Too much, you smooth it too much. But if you do it at exactly the right time scale that our algorithm heuristic told you to aggregate, then you recover the 3 important events that are there. You see sort of anomalies, that's an attack on a computer network at the right scale and not anywhere else. You see periodicity. You see the mode change. So Damien, that's yours. That's when you see there's a stationary process and there is another stationary process, and then there's a change, right? There's a modality change. There's a process change that is behind the model change. What you can notice, none of it is explanatory. All of it is just the tools to get to understand what's going on in the network, in dynamic networks. you can extract periodic patterns, all periodic patterns that are periodic for a little while, that are even sub-patterns. So anything like this. Here's one pattern that shows up every 2 time steps for a while. Here's another one that shows up every time step for a while. And why would that be interesting? It gives you a nice kind of signature of the entire dynamics of the network. It's another way of looking at this frequency decomposition, at the rhythm of the network. You can have sort of diurnal, daily, seasonal, yearly, evolutionary scales and patterns that happen there. So it also differentiates between, it allows to compare dynamic networks. One thing we don't know how to do at all, in fact, is compare networks. I was very curious because I was really waiting for something to come out of that session. And I was, so I was kind of disappointed, as I'm sure everybody else. But yeah, so we maybe know somewhat what to do with static networks, but for dynamic networks, there's only one good idea, not this. And here's another decent idea, maybe, of how to compare dynamic networks. So if you extract all periodic patterns, so here's the number of patterns that have a period of 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and so on, 7 days, 31 days, if you extended those, 365 days. So, animal or human? Of course it is. More than human. It's corporate. It's Enron email network, right? Right? So there's very strong rhythm of days, weeks, quarters, years. What about this one? There are lots and lots of periodic patterns that show up every day, and then the next peak is 365. Animal or human? Really? You think that animals, you biologists, come on, think that animals know about 365 days?
Some things that have one day a year where they annually do thing X. Yeah.
But 365? No. Close enough. It's IMDb, International Movie Database. So all of these are things like Oscars, Grammys. You know, this is a group of individuals that come together for pictures once a year. Right? There are lots of patterns like this. Here's what animal ones look like. So I was told a couple of times by biologists when they saw this that there's this decay, exponential decay of the patterns. That this is memory in the system, and I'm still trying to figure out why that means memory in the system. I don't know. You can stare at it for a while. Okay, so it gives you a nice signature, a way to compare across different networks. Just like motifs, if you've heard about it for static networks, motifs for static networks gives you a way to compare static networks. This is kind of temporal, right away temporal decomposition, temporal motifs. Okay, it also gives you actual patterns. Probably the most powerful tool, which I'm sort of blatantly taking time because I know I was supposed to have more than 30 minutes if I spoke in the morning. So.
I'm surprised. Sorry.
Huh?
I'm surprised. I didn't know.
Yeah, I realized when we put when I realized, sure. Okay, but I'm almost done. So probably the most powerful tool, and that's what started my whole social network analysis in animals thing, is the question. Okay, so there's discussion fusion dynamics. There's maybe all kinds of, we observe rearrangements in groups, but is there any consistency and persistence of interactions over time, of groupings over time, of relationships over time? And so that to me was a question about communities, except in time, or temporal clustering of some sort. So if we have these observations, let's simplify. We don't observe networks, we actually observe groups. There's a version of it for networks, but we observe groups, snapshots of groups. And now the question is there something that's kind of consistent over time? So we want to somehow come to the point of saying, there's this blue community, the green community, and the red. They're fluid, so we allow things like, that was a visit. 2 just visited. Wasn't a member of the blue community. And then maybe it joins. And then there's, 4, which is the core member, but then 2 kind of floats around. It was a member of green, became red, So we want to be able to fit some explanation like this, some communities like this, some clustering, so it's like this to those data, right? Somehow, they find the best fit. So a community, if you look at Wasserman and Faust textbook, is defined as cohesive subgroups of actors among whom there are relatively strong, direct, intense, frequent, or positive ties. And to me, the keyword here is relatively. Relative to what? Right? Well, it's relative. It's among them relative to the others, right? Which means it's a definition of a cluster, really. Right? It means that the individuals within community are closer to each other in some space than they are to individuals in others, which is why we fit things like GLMs and other clustering techniques work. Except any clustering technique, so now there's a proliferation of, for static networks, of community inference methods, and they're all based essentially on different interpretations of a clustering method. It's various versions of the nodes in the community are closer to each other than they are to nodes in other communities, right, in the network. So, and if we're going to do it dynamically, for dynamic networks, we have to find the right definition of closer, right? More frequent, more whatever, more something. And there have been, non-surprisingly, many definitions of what does it mean to be temporally closer to each other than it is to points in other clusters. And they are, I mean, the range of what it means to be closer, anything from pure count of frequencies and contiguous frequencies, and we've been guilty of that, that's what it says. Contiguous frequencies to one of the most sort of original one is this GraphScope. It's information theoretic minimum description clustering fitting to the entire network. It's an information theoretic approach, so it's the clustering that minimizes entropy essentially in the network. Okay. We decided to go back, after a few false starts, decided to go back to sort of the definition of the social space. So if we're saying that communities are some objects that exist, they're latent objects, right? And we observe them through the interactions, that somehow they drive the interactions among the individuals that we observe, and we want to infer the communities from observing these interactions, right? Then there is, these communities exist in some social space. So the closeness that we need to measure for clustering, the distance that we have to define, has to come from that social space. And so this distance we define in terms of costs, and the costs are come from these three principles, that individuals are if indeed individuals interact with others in a community because they are members of this community, right? Then there is this notion of switching a community identification, right? You can switch a community, but there is a cost to it. And in fact, I was told by some biologists that that cost of switching is measurable. So when an individual switches a community affiliation, such as a baboon changing a troop or a zebra changing a harem, I feel like there's going to be rotten tomatoes being thrown at me in a moment. But I have it on good authority that the stress hormones go up, the harassment levels go up, access to resources goes down, and social status drops, typically. So, I mean, these are some of these measures of a cost, of a social cost. There's also individuals, if the indeed community has a meaning, then individuals are mostly seen with the members of their own community, although they can visit others, but there's a cost to visit. And so it's more or less the same, except there are instances where you can differentiate a visit versus a switch. And in fact, sometimes the visit is more than the switch, costs more than the switch, because the visit is seen as an attack. And in other cases, the visit is less than a switch because it's seen as a less threatening thing. Okay? And there's also, and this is purely for data sparsity reasons, because if we observed all individuals at all times, we wouldn't need this. But because in typical biological data many individuals are not observed, the only thing we can say about them that they were not with the members of their community, and so there is a cost of absence. And the cost of absence is typically measured, is a measurable cost. It's a cost of access to information and social advancement, social opportunity. But if we, it's inferred, we wouldn't need it for data purposes if we observed all individuals at all times. Okay, so given these three costs, they actually define a social space, and now we can run clustering algorithms. You can also think about it if you're more comfortable with statistical models. Here's the model that this is equivalent to. At each time step, individuals declare that they're members of some community. That's their own color. And then they declare that they join a particular group. They go and join a particular group. And so if the probability of switching a community affiliation from one time step to another is less than half, and probability of joining a group which is not your color is less than half, then the maximum likelihood fit of this model is exactly what I just described before as clustering and social space, social cost space. Okay? This is also, if you're comfortable with block mixture model, this is a direct generalization of block mixture models to dynamic version of it. So anyway, so we can fit it efficiently, we can fit it nicely, and here's what we get. Here's the back to baboons. This is the sleeping network, so time goes from left to right, and so we have every box is baboons actually observed more or less together. They were within 10 feet of each other, you know, sometime before waking up. And then these red edges, and this is the best fit, right? So this is best fit, algorithmic fit. So the red edges are interpreted as switch of community affiliation, and this means this one visited. So clearly somewhere around here there was big upheaval of lots of switches, lots of visits. There's like total rearrangement of communities around here, and we still haven't gone back to data, have we? No, okay. We think there was a leopard in the area. Right. So okay, here's what it gives for zebras, and here's why dynamics matter. So if you, this is a human observed network over 9 months of 28 or 9 dreaded zebras, and if you aggregate it over the entire 9 months, here's the network that you have. Anybody can anybody point to a community? Come on. Wake up. Point.
That guy.
That guy. I mean, here's the community, right? Of course it's a trick question, if I wouldn't be asking it. So here's the dynamic version of the same network. If unfold time goes from top to bottom, this big blob is this and then some. So it's the red and green. So to help you, purely for visualization purposes, here's the coloring of each node with which it appears the majority of the time here. Right? So here's, this blob is made of reds and greens, and then there are a couple of two just whatever visitors, occasional. The interesting thing to note is that there's L, except this one, but then it turns out there's L after most of the names here, which means they're lactating females. So green ones are lactating. These guys are non-lactating. There's a stallion that has to stay with lactating females most of the time. Again, there's probably some biological meaning to it, right? The fact that there's actually two communities, not one. And if you sit, so what you can do now, so this is, again, this is a rule and not an explanation, but it can lead to some understanding of what's going on. This is a descriptive model in this case. So you can take this community analysis, this clustering, and you can measure a whole bunch of things in it. For each individual, you can measure how many switches it had, how many switching costs it paid, how many visits it had in this explanation, what is the minimum maximum duration of the communities it's been in, average, whatever. What is the size of the communities, how heterogeneous versus homogeneous they were, and so on and so forth. So you can measure a whole bunch of things for each individual. And so now each individual is a point in this multidimensional space of measures on its dynamic communities. And you can look at it as a statistical space and look at, let's say, first to however many, you can do principal component analysis on that statistical space. Turns out that simple linear principal component analysis is good enough. We've tested. And so now each point, this is the projection on the first two principal components that gives more than 70%, that explain more than 70% of the variance of the data. So this is hand drawn, but here's what comes out. All the non-lactating females, all the lactating females, there's more than one mapping to the same point. All the bachelors and all the stallions. So there's clear different social behavior of these demographic types, right? So the social. So now going back, yes, this dynamic communities actually have some give some insight into how demographic types translate into social behavior. I don't know why. I'm not a biologist, but it's okay. You can compare between different populations. I don't know. So between different species, sorry, this is same gravies, and then there's onagers. You can compute the same kind of statistics on both species, and now the interesting thing is, so for all the points, here's all the males are blue, the females are red. They map to very distinct regions within this statistical space of dynamic community behavior characteristics. Right, so you can now start gaining insight into the dynamics of their social behavior, but statistically sort of founded in some ways. That's my social network. Thank you.